This episode is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average. Quote now at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates, national average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, the second week of July 1936, deadly heat is spreading across the Great Lakes region. It would hit well above 100 degrees in cities like Green Bay, Wisconsin and Duluth, Minnesota. It would continue for days, weeks. There were parts of the Dakotas that hit over 120 degrees that summer. Because of the extreme temperatures and the fact that it was in a part of the country not used to such high heat, the heat wave of 1936 is largely considered the most destructive heat wave in modern U.S. history. But of course, that all seems to be changing year by year, summer by summer, as the heat map of the U.S. and the world is getting rewritten in real time due to the effects of climate change. So maybe there is something to be learned by traveling back to that scorching hot summer of 1936. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
NIki, you're a resident Midwesterner. Can you tell us what your hometown of Indiana, which, by the way, I looked up the record heat numbers in Indiana, and they are from this summer of 1936. But this part of the region not really equipped. I don't know if anyone's equipped for 115, 120, but this region of the country.
Well, in the places that get up to 115, that's the dry heat. And the Midwest is very much a wet heat. It does get hot and humid in the summers. But growing up in southern Indiana, it was very rare to see something that was in the triple digits, much less, 110 is not something that we would have seen. So this is an area of the country where, it's like it used to be, at least, 80s were a hot, humid summer day.
Yeah. I grew up in the Midwest, too, and I lived in North Dakota for 4 years. And in the summer, you might get a day that's hot, really hot, but then the next several days it cools down. It's not sustained heat, and I think that's the big difference here too, is that it's one thing to be 106 for a day. It's another thing to be 106 for weeks on end. Yeah. It's unbearable.
And so when we talk about the sort of political or policy or social implications of this heat wave, a lot of it does have to do with where it hit, what the length of it, though, meaning it was sort of something that people couldn't really escape or dismiss as a sort of abnormality or a blip. They had to sort of reckon with what it means, which again is so evocative of what's happening now. But we'll get to that fallout. But I'm just curious: do we have some of the stories about just how bad it was are pretty stunning. It feels Mad Max-esque.
Yes. I mean, when I think about just the numbers, 5,000 people died. Another 1,000 people die in Canada. The sad tragedy that newborns are dying. Newborns that are born in delivery rooms where there's very little AC or no AC. Elderly people are hit particularly hard. 21 people died in New York because they were trying to get cool and probably couldn't really swim. And so people are sleeping outside, sleeping, in fire escapes, wetting blankets down, and then trying to sleep inside that, cool blanket to get cool. People were not equipped to fight off.
Right. And it's going to have systemic effects as well, right? It must be messing with the infrastructure. It must be messing with crops. How is the sort of stuff of the country holding up in addition to the people?
There are bridges that natural infrastructure or infrastructure that could collapse, that could weaken. I remember this was years ago. I was in Las Vegas and I was walking on the sidewalk and my shoes started to melt on the side. The rubber soles started to stick on the sidewalk. I think there's a lot of big and little things we don't think about when we have sustained heat over a long period of time. there were Olympic athletes. The trials were taking place in New York City that summer. Athletes were collapsing. Crops were failing because, who can plant anything when it's so dry, when it's basically a drought? That raises the price on everything. So there are all of these domino effects that happen when you have this prolonged heat.
Right. And we're talking about 1936. And so when you're talking about crop failures, Kellie, and drought, this is taking place in the context of the Great Depression. This is taking place in the context of the Dust Bowl. Already, there's another part of the country that has been so dried out and so, frankly, mismanaged in terms of land management that it has functionally turned into a desert. And Rex Tugwell, who's one of the New Dealers with the Roosevelt administration, is like, if this continues, St. Louis is going to become the capital of the new American desert, where before it was like out in Oklahoma and out in Kansas. And so there was this sense that, like, in the middle of this enormous economic catastrophe, it was entirely possible that this environmental catastrophe was going to spread as well. And I think one thing that we don't really think about is the way that the New Deal and environmental management were the same project. I feel like we talk about things like the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the Civilian Conservation Corps, and it's like, these alphabet agencies, and we're making work for people. But those were both about trying to find a way to rescue the land from particularly like drought. And the story of the heat wave is about, what do we do now? Because things are getting worse instead of better.
Yeah.
So you look back at so many of the New Deal programs, and obviously we think about like jobs programs and industrial programs, but it's like planting trees and dealing with crops and all that stuff. Conservation is a huge part of it too. And I think this heat wave of 36 sort of put all that in sharp relief. A few of the other details from that summer. I mean, you mentioned sticky streets. I mean, so this moved like the whole country. We're talking about the Midwest, but the whole country felt this in the sort of first half of July. New York City, the bridges across the East and Harlem River were stuck in the open position, and the streets were literally melting. Oh, and one other little tidbit here. This is a little bit of an aside, but one of the few places people could find refuge was movie theaters, which was one of the few places that had air conditioning. And it's so interesting. I mean, I did a series last year about kind of the rise of Hollywood in the 30s and into the 40s. And you just look at the number of people that were going to the movies in the 30s and the way that industry just absolutely exploded in that era. And obviously that had to do with sort of changing technology and consumer culture and sort of mass media and so forth. But I do wonder if a big part of it was that movie theaters were just a communal place where people could escape the heat. Like maybe that had a lot to do with the fact that the movie industry exploded in the mid-30s. It's just an interesting little explanation.
Can I also add a tidbit that, like, if you go back to look at pictures from this moment, and you see all of these people sort of like trying to sleep or take naps in like fields, and the women are wearing stockings, the men have on pants, and they rolled up just like their sleeves on their long sleeve shirts, like up to their elbows. But I'm like, oh my, where's your tank top? Where's your crop top? Where are your booty shorts? Like, I would be half near naked out there in that field. Like, I think about how now when we dress when it's hot, like we basically strip completely down. But like in the 1930s, during very much a respectability era, I mean, women were still wearing their stockings in the heat and, long dresses that went past their knees, and men still wore pants and long sleeve shirts, and undershirts underneath those shirts, and that's just unfathomable to me. But
right. And not to get all fashion history, the fabrics were more breathable than the fabrics we wear now, but still, like, there's something really impressive.
More breathable?
About
I would have thought less.
Yeah, I think about this all the time. I guess like wool is breathable even when it's hot, but I don't know. I feel like I look back and I'm like, oh gosh,
it's not wicking
like
fabric,
3
right?
layers. Right.
But what you're buying off of Shein is not the highest quality fabric.
Right.
Yes,
but I gotta say, I do think about this a lot when I look at like period pieces or I look at old photographs, and most of the time I'm like, man, that just must have been like hot, sweaty.
Like a 3-piece suit, forget about it. Like
definitely those stockings.
Dresses, no way.
what's the one thing that most history books all over the world have in common? That they're seriously lacking in the melanin department. Wondery's podcast, Black History for Real, introduces you to the most overlooked Black history makers you should already know. Follow Black History for Real on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to Black History for Real early and ad-free now by joining Wondery Plus. Discover more to the story with Wondery's other top history podcasts.
Shalom, dear listeners. This is Daniil Hartman.
And I'm Yossi Klein Halevi.
Together we host the podcast For Heaven's Sake from the Shalom Hartman Institute.
These have been some of the most challenging days for me personally, for Israel, and for the Jewish people. And one of the ways in which I've gotten through this is that I've found solace and meaning through discussions with my dear friend and study partner, Daniil Hartman.
And I hope that listeners will join us as we continue to tackle the pressing questions facing the Jewish people here at For Heaven's Sake, which has become the #1 Judaism podcast.
Tune into For Heaven's Sake at shalomhartman.org/For Heaven's Sake, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And this really was an anomalous heat wave, right?
Yeah.
With the heat that emerged was from a combination of anomalous forces. There were the man-made ones, and we've kind of talked about some of these, that all of that poor land management, particularly over farming in the plain states, had turned the plains into the great American desert. And that desert was soaking up all of this heat and turning the Great Plains into a furnace. That makes the air hotter there, and that hot air spreads. But there was also like this natural phenomenon that was happening at the time where both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans were unusually warm in a way that just jacked up the overall temperatures and jack up the overall temperatures relatively early in the season. Like, we're not talking about deep August. This time in early July is when people are just getting used to like slightly warmer, even mildly hot weather in the Midwest. Totally. Certainly up in the upper Midwest, summer is really just starting to settle in. And so to have these extremely high temperatures this early in the season, that acclimation that you're kind of talking about, Jody, that like people are kind of used to warmer weather because they're not in the air conditioning all the time. They hadn't had that time to acclimate.
For me, it's the pendulum swing. You know, like, you don't realize how much, like, the difference between, like, 90 degrees and 100 degrees or 105 degrees really does feel like you feel it instantly. You feel it in the reverse. Living in North Dakota, I remember it was like -30. And then the next day, it went up to 32 degrees. And I was walking outside with no jacket on. And I was like,
shorts out.
Yes. I was like, it's spring. And my husband's like, it's 32 degrees outside. I was like, but it was a 60-degree swing. And so, you know, we're just not built for these, like, you know, even incremental shifts is a lot for us.
Yeah. Okay, so we've laid out kind of how bad it was and some of the reasons and some of the conversation that spurred about what was going on, which, again, feels so relevant to now. And equally relevant to now is this sense of kind of how there was a response, both politically, policy, socio-economically. So it's worth pointing out 1936 is an election year. FDR's running for a second term. People are throes of the Great Depression. The farming crisis is a huge part of what FDR is trying to kind of address. FDR goes on a tour of the Great Plains, and he reports that, we need to have a radical adjustment of the activities and our approach to farming in these areas. There's a push for new farming methods and techniques. And then there's this other little interesting tidbit that the heat wave breaks up right as Roosevelt is coming through town. I don't know if that sort of works in his favor, but like he does kind of tour right when, which is interesting. But I want to put it just in this larger Great Depression context, because it seems to me like Roosevelt was able to tell a story and the country was willing to listen to a story about how these things are all connected. The economic trouble we're in, the geopolitical trouble that we're in, and this heat that we're experiencing are all part of the same story. And moreover, Roosevelt was able to convince, not as easy as people seem to think, we've done plenty of episodes on that, but Roosevelt was able to convince the country that government has a role to play in answering this. And that feels so different from now. And I think about climate change and the heat we're experiencing now with regards to the story, but I also think about the pandemic as another one of these kind of like ambient, touches everyone, very kind of like agnostic threats. And, you know, my basic take on the pandemic was like, as a country, we decided to fight about COVID rather than fight against COVID.
Yeah.
And in some way, I'm feeling the same way about climate change. We've decided to fight about climate change rather than against climate change. And in this era, in the 30s, it does seem like there was this larger sense of, well, we can fight this large, all-encompassing threat together.
Yeah.
It's interesting because when I realized that this was falling in the middle of a presidential election year and even the campaign season, because it's in July, I was like, well, this could cut one of two ways. Like, people could say, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? It sucked in the middle of the Great Depression, but look, now we're all dying of heat. Like, things haven't gotten better. Or it could be what it was, which is Roosevelt went around and he got to do... I remember Barack Obama in 2012 going around after Superstorm Sandy, hanging out with people in New Jersey and New York and being there to console people and to serve as somebody who was like, we're going to rebuild. And getting people to sort of like rally around him instead of fighting him. And that's what Roosevelt does. Roosevelt talks about the tragedy in the way that he talked about all tragedies in his fireside chats, where he gives this very evocative account of how bad things are, but then also talks about reconstructing things, about bringing in aid, about creating a different kind of future. And that's only backed up by the fact that he comes when the rain, the break of the heat does, right? Because people are like, oh, when Roosevelt comes to town, the heat breaks.
It rains.
Kind of magic.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think the idea created a narrative in which the federal government is the savior, is what people were desperately looking for. And so Roosevelt knows how to harp on all of that.
Yeah. All right. Final thoughts here. Let's just talk about heat. I think we were bantering before we started recording here. None of us are fans of heat, I think. I personally am susceptible to...
I mean, I'm not a fan of the cold either. Can I just...
That's true.
Kelly wants it to be 70 degrees every day.
Yes.
Did I mention to you, too, that I happened to be... It was like a total coincidence and something that I should have seen coming, but I didn't see coming. But I happened to be in Death Valley on what is... It's a little contested, but potentially the hottest day ever recorded on human record. It was 129 or 130 degrees, and I was there. This was 2 years ago.
That's crazy.
Maybe 3 years ago.
Don't care for that.
In July.
No thanks.
I did not care for it, but I gotta say, it's so cliche, but it is, the dry heat thing is true. Like, I mean, I walked out and I was like, my body was like, I don't know how to deal with this. But I was able to sort of just stand there and be still in a way that if it had been at all humid, I would have, I think, literally just keeled over.
Oh, God.
But I've never experienced anything like that. It was pretty wild.
I tap out in the high 90s. And I think because I'm also quite fair-skinned, like I have very little sun tolerance as well. So the combination of the heat and the sun, I was chatting with you all before this, but I was in Mesa Verde, Colorado, and it was just too hot for me. And I was like, get me to a mountain. Get me somewhere where it's 65, because I can't do even the dry heat, which is definitely noticeably different. But trying to like protect myself from both sun and heat was too much work for a vacation.
No. Two years ago, I was in Europe, in Paris, where they had that big heat wave. It hit 106.
Right.
We had no air conditioning. And I think it was like the day before we were about to come back to the States, too. And I've never been more like, get me back home. Like,
the croissants aren't worth it.
I know, the croissants aren't worth it. Nothing's worth it. Like, I put my kids in swimsuits and we sprayed each other with water bottles and the water hose and just like... had fans going nonstop, but it's still that like hot air that like blows on you. It's still not it's not a good feeling. Cold showers are kind of the only way you can get around it.
All right, let's leave it there. I hope you go drink a cold lemonade or sit inside the AC or something. But Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
The can is really the reason why We're having a heat wave, a tropical heat wave. The temperature's rising, it isn't surprising. She certainly can. She started the heat wave.
Radiotopia.